This is World Insight, and this is the last part in this week's programme. For our final story, we continue our series on the 30th anniversary of China's reform and opening up policies. These policies have not only led to fast economic growth and an improvement in everyday living standards, but it has also opened China's door for exchanges with the outside world. Since the 1980s, more and more foreigners, just like me, have come to China and seen China's development. Some have been closely tied with the country for more than 20 years, and their lives have been changing along with that of China itself.
An ordinary day for David Moser. He's an American but has been living in Beijing for more than 10 years. He is now working as academic director in Capital Normal University. Moser's connection with China started in 1988 when he was a student in Peking University. 20 years had passed since then, but he still remembers the feeling when he first came.
Well, I was someone who had prepared a lot. I had read a lot of books on China. I had read something about, current Chinese history at that time. But even so, I was very surprised when I got here, because reading about it and seeing it and experiencing it are really two different things. You read that it was a world of bicycles, and then where we had cars everywhere, the Chinese had bicycles everywhere. And you think you understand that, but it's not until you came here and actually felt what it was like to live in this environment where everything was by bicycle back then. There were very few cars. It was quite an amazing experience, and even riding a bicycle at that time was a very hazardous undertaking, because the roads at that time were not as well paved as they are now. There were a lot of dirt roads, and so I had to concentrate a great deal while riding a bicycle. Just not to run into other people was a great challenge.
我叫莫大伟，我来自美国，我祝小朋友玩得开心，吃毛毛香，晚上睡觉不要尿炕。
Moser became a well-known figure in China by performing crosstalk, a traditional form of Chinese comedy, in the 1990s. He also met his Chinese wife in Beijing and began his own family. Mixed marriages were rarely seen in China 20 years ago.
Beijing was a little better than the countryside back then, but even back then, Beijing, a foreigner was not that common, because most of us who came were usually at the universities, and it wasn't as easy to come then, and there wasn't as many tourist locations, so there were very few foreigners on the street. So everywhere you go, you would hear "Lao Wai," "Lao Wai," was a foreigner, and you just got used to it. It was just a fact of life. And it was quite a bit different than it is now. Now, of course, I go on the street, a foreigner, we see them every day. It's not that big of a deal.
Before the mid-1980s, there were very few foreigners in Beijing, and there was very little choice of where they could live. But the deepening of China's reform and opening up gradually broke down the restrictions.
What's interesting to me now is that when I first came to China, most people who came here were very focused on China. In other words, they would not come here unless they really, really were interested in China and Chinese culture. The difference now is my students, many of them come here, they're not necessarily interested just in China or in living here or in making a career in China, but they want to come here and they want to find out what's going on. And they want to explore, what it's like. Because China now is important in and of itself. It's important economically to the U.S. It's important for the future. Knowledge of Chinese language is also an asset for them.
The late leader Deng Xiaoping was considered the architect of China's reform and opening up, which began in the late 1970s. Rapid economic development was one of the most remarkable achievements since then.
I talk a lot about Deng Xiaoping in my classes when I teach. Because I teach the students about Chinese history, and especially the modernization, after Mao, the opening up period. And I talk about Deng Xiaoping a lot. I think he was a genius, actually, in a certain way, which is that he knew that China had to change. He knew that China had to develop and it had to open itself up to the outside world. That was for sure. But he knew that this was a very complicated process, and that not only was he not smart enough, nobody was smart enough to know how to do that. And so he just made the decision, okay, I'm going to open up. I'm not going to plan it, no 5-year plan, no 10-year plan. We're just going to open up and see what happens. And so he opened things up and he let the creativity of the Chinese people and the foreigners working with them to let this modernization happen.
Over the 30 years, China's average annual growth was around 10%. Economic modernization has transformed the world's most populous country in many aspects.
Without a doubt, the change has been incredible, amazing. I think Chinese people have an amazing ability to adapt and to just accept these fast changes without too much culture shock, almost. But for some foreigners like us, we look at it and are just amazed. Because I remember it didn't seem that long ago that Beijing was a very different place. And they've managed to pull off a quite incredible change. And I would just hope that they would try to pay more attention now that everyone is much better off. You have a rising middle class. And China's, at least economically and in terms of its infrastructure and economic development, it's pretty stable now. I just hope that now the Chinese people can go back and pay more attention to the indigenous Chinese culture and try to preserve that and bring it back. And some of the things they have forgotten or lost in the process of modernization can now begin to come back.
He's a horror writer.
That's right.
Back home in the east of Beijing, Moser enjoys time with his family. He calls his daughter a China-US joint venture, as he can see both Chinese and American culture in her. For many foreigners like Moser, enjoying life in China now is just as easy as for many ordinary Chinese.
Well, in closing, China's reforms have propelled the country from a poor, backward status to one of the most important economies in the world today. Although China still has a long way to go before emerging as a fully developed economy, the country is now moving fast towards that goal. And its increasing exposure to the outside world has given other countries better opportunities to know more about China. With that, we come to the end of this program. If you've got any comments or suggestions, you know what to do. You can email us at worldinsight@cctv.com. I'm James Chow, and me and the team here in Beijing. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you again in 7 days' time.